So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third Women in Water lecture series of 2022. My name is Andrea Rowe, and I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist at the Global Institute for Water Security and Global Water Futures here at the University of Saskatchewan. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all who have joined today and begin by acknowledging that we are all participating from the traditional territories of First Peoples across this country. The University of Saskatchewan is located on Treaty 6 territory and traditional homeland of the Métis. All of us are meeting here today from different places within and outside of Canada to talk about water. Water is the lifeblood of people and societies, connecting us to each other. Wherever you are, please take a moment and acknowledge the Indigenous heritage of the lands where you live and work. And we pay respect to the Indigenous ancestors of these lands and waters, reaffirming our relationship with each other and our desire to have a productive and positive discussion today. Before we begin, I would just like to go over a couple of logistics. If you would like to listen in French, please press the globe-shaped interpretation button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and French interpretation is available. In addition, if you would like to take advantage of the closed captioning, you can press the CC button as well, and closed captioning should become available. Today's event will be approximately 1 hour in length, and all participants will remain muted. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we will leave 10 minutes at the end to take up the questions with our host and guests for today. The presentation is being recorded in both French and English and will be available after on the Global Water Futures YouTube channel. I would also like to take a moment to recognize our sponsors, Global Water Futures and the Global Water Futures Young Professionals Program and the Global Institute for Water Security for committing the resources to make this series a reality. In addition, I'd like to recognize our virtual audience joining us from all around the world today, and especially the young professionals joining from our network at the University of Saskatchewan, Laurier, Waterloo, and McMaster. In addition, this year we are planning to launch a Women in Water expert list to develop even more ways to highlight women and those other researchers that are working on gender impacts of water research. And so if you're interested in joining the Women in Water expert list or being considered for that, please sign up and indicate your interest for any one of the lectures this season, and we'll be in touch with you in the spring of 2022 with more information. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn over the discussion now to my colleague, Dr. Corin Schuster-Wallace.
Thank you, Andrea. As Andrea noted, I'm Corin Schuster-Wallace. I'm a water health researcher here at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm Associate Director of Global Water Futures. I'm also the founder, with a great deal of support, of the Women in Water lecture series. And today is February 10th, and the lecture today, the date has been deliberately chosen because tomorrow, February 11th, marks the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, which is sponsored by UNESCO and UN Women. And this year, the theme for the event in New York is Water Unites Us. And this is in recognition of the role that women and girls play, not only as beneficiaries, but also as agents of change. And this is with respect to accelerating progress towards achievement of water-related Sustainable Development Goal targets. And for those of you in Canada who are committed to achieving these targets, I invite you to check out www.canadawaterdecade.net for resources and inspiration, but also to share your resources and activities with others. And another initiative that I'm thrilled to be involved in has led to today's conversation focused on women, water, and food security. And this is a space where women's roles in food production intersect with climate change, obviously with water, but also their roles in domestic water management. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce our host for today, my colleague and project lead, Dr. Sabine Liebenim, who is an associate professor in agricultural and developmental economics with joint appointments in the departments of agricultural and resource economics and also economics here at the University of Saskatchewan. Sabine's research focuses on improving our understanding of economic decision-making among households living in rural and remote settings who are often exposed to adverse environments with limited access to formal safety net mechanisms. And Sabine works primarily with rural agricultural households in Southeast Asia and West Africa, but she's also currently establishing a collaboration with a First Nation community in Northern Alberta in Canada. So Sabine, over to you. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Corinne, and thanks for the nice introduction. This lecture today, as Corinne already mentioned, hosts basically researchers involved in the Queen Elizabeth Advanced Scholar Program. And this project aims basically to develop water security solutions that contribute to enhance gender equity in West African nations like Ghana, Senegal, and Burkina Faso, where women and girls are hit hardest by impacts of climate change. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today the three speakers that we have. The first speaker is Dr. Alira Veyori. He's a postdoc research fellow at the Institute of Development and Agriculture Economics at the Leibniz University, Hanover, Germany. So my alma mater back in Germany. Alira's research interest includes food security, poverty, vulnerability, climate change and adaptations, agriculture intensification, and also rural-urban migration. Alira has worked extensively with rural households across sub-Saharan Africa and also recently in Southeast Asia. Our second speaker is Dr. Margaret Atuzina Akuriba. Margaret holds a PhD in development economics from Wageningen University from the Netherlands. She's an academic at the School of Applied Economics and Management Science of the University for Development Studies in Tamale in northern Ghana. And Dr. Akuriba's current research focuses on irrigation governance and approaches to strengthening agribusiness value chains for food security and rural development. Finally, our third speaker is Dr. Thierno Malik Diallo. He's a lecturer at Gaston Berger University of Saint Louis in Senegal. His research centers around labor economics, gender, poverty, and rural economics. And Dr. Diallo has been extensively involved in collaborations, for example, with PEP, the Partnership for Economic Policy from Laval University in Canada, but also internationally with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, and the African Economic Research Consortium. So I welcome the three speakers of today, and I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Alira.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabine Leibniz, and thank you, my fellow panelists, and thank you, Corinne, for this invitation. Just a minute as I try to share my screen with you. Okay. Do you see my screen at the moment? Okay, great. So once again, thanks very much, Corinne and the colleagues at the Global Water Research. And I'm very thrilled to join you guys for this all-important lecture today. And as Professor Leibniz has already mentioned, my name is Alira Veyori, and I'm with the Institute for Agriculture and Development Economics here in Hanover Leibniz University. And so basically what I will do today is just to take you through my research and then to try to guide you on what I have done so far and what I see to be some of the pressing issues when it comes to food security, climate change, and the gender issues as it relates to Sub-Saharan Africa. So planning this talk was a little bit exhaustive because I had a lot of information I would like to share with you, but the time spot would not allow. So I tried to frame my talk around the topic I call climate shocks, food insecurity in Sub-Saharan Africa, and making a case for closing the gender gap. So what is the problem with we face currently in Sub-Saharan Africa? So climate change, as we all know, remains a very critical issue in development, especially for developing countries where there is few coping strategies and few really strong and resilient coping mechanisms for households. So it means that households, especially in these rural areas, are exposed to a lot of shocks as it relates to climate change. There are negative ones like drought. And if you are conversant with the news in recent times, we've seen in TV that a lot of countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, have started experiencing severe drought, and this is leading to food security issues. And this food security issues has also expanded to include vulnerability to poverty, because most of these households have their households in one, their livelihoods in one way or the other linked up to the rainfall in this area or to the weather patterns in this area. And like I already said, the impact is higher for Sub-Saharan Africa, especially because of the absence of credit and insurance, as well as other factor markets. These are areas of the world where credit is very scarce and insurance schemes are not properly developed, as well as factor markets where people can easily take any output and go and sell to make up for these losses that they are experiencing. Secondly, there is also the issue that these households are largely dependent on rain-fed agricultural production systems. So there are no readily available and the strong irrigation systems in these countries where they can easily depend on when there is a drought or there is lack of water. This effect, although at the household level, is very critical for developing areas and for these poor and vulnerable households. Research has shown that the effect is larger for female-headed households, and this is in spite of the fact that in these areas, population shares remains almost 50-50. In some countries, the population of females to males is actually even higher. So if this is the case, why is it so for the females? Even though their population is higher, the impact of climate change is higher for females. And this is as found out is because of the skewed ownership of productive assets. Most of these countries, a lot of productive assets are owned by men, or they are owned by men-headed households, and women are relegated to the background. For example, ownership of land, which is a very important asset in agricultural production, is mostly owned by men. And women are kind of relegated when it comes to inheritance or inheriting land. And most of these households who are rather females are like either because the husband has died or the husband has moved out. And so when it happens that way, these productive assets are indirectly taken over by the man's extended families. And also women have a tendency of facing reduced coping ability because traditionally they are always engaged by traditional roles that are non-remunerative and they are not paid. So in terms of resources, they still lag behind. So these are some of the reasons that is found to show that to support why women households are really those mostly affected by climate change impacts at the household level. For example, then you ask the question, what is a typical rural household economy look like? So these households, as I already mentioned, are very vulnerable to climate shocks because of their agricultural dependent production, and they are mostly small scale. And when we talk about small scale, if you haven't been to a developing country before, you will not understand this, what it means by small scale, but these are households who have just between 1 to 2.5 or even 0.5 to 2.5 acres of land, not even a hectare. And traditionally, these farms are mainly for staple crop production, and then they depend on rain-fed agriculture, for water needs, okay? And traditionally, the economy is supported by crop production, you have livestock, and then self-employment. And if you can see here, the contribution of each of these different portfolios to the household income, you will then understand why these houses are really very vulnerable to climate shocks, because crop and livestock, which are really water dependent, contribute between 60 to 90% of the household income. So if this all important portfolio which is water dependent is hit hard, then it means the household economy is going to collapse. Okay, so how is this going to be addressed going forward, or what is the way forward for this? The only way forward from the research I have been doing and from different analysis which has been conducted is to come to an agreement that the sustainable livelihood approach is the way forward, where there is the household combines livelihood assets, different livelihood assets and portfolios to engage in livelihood strategies which are beneficial and which would have a way of improving their sustainability or expand their coping ability and increase their sustenance by reducing their vulnerability to these shocks, so that they can have a wide range of activities on which they can depend on in case in case there is a shock, so that the shock of probably a rainfall does not collapse their economy, as you could see in the previous slide. So in going forward, they diversify away from rain-fed agriculture and have other activities that bring in income to them, right? So in conclusion and summary, I am currently working on climate shocks, and what I see is that climate shocks have a significant negative effect on welfare. So it increases the incidence of food insecurity, it increases vulnerability to poverty, and then it decreases the household consumption because there is reduced productivity at the farm level, and there is a negative effect on crop production, reducing how much is available for these households to consume. Most of these households, by the way, are dependent on own production to feed their household members. And the resilience of the rural economy, which is dependent on rain-fed agriculture, depends on how much diversification exists. Okay, so the more the rural economy is diversified, the more resilient it is. Okay, so access to productive assets like land, credit, and education are critical factors which drive up diversification. And these are things that should be deliberately targeted by policymakers to drive their ownership towards women, and as a way to empower them and make them more economically strong and economically resilient, because more women are affected by shocks in terms of climate compared to men, and they are also the group of the gender group which lacks these assets, all important assets, to build up their coping mechanisms in terms of shocks. And in terms of diversification, my very recent paper, which I did on diversification, shows that diversification is really very important for these households, and that it is positively correlated with welfare enhancement, especially diversification into livestock ownership, the ownership of small livestock like goat, like sheep, and those animals which do not cost so much to own, yet to the poor and vulnerable households, they are a distance away from them. So these things and also off-farm income activities are particularly important if you want to make these rural households very important and very economically strong to be able to stand up to the idea of climate change shocks on their food security, and as well as making them engage in life-changing or transformation activities for their livelihood. And with that, I come to the very last thing that I need to talk about, which is that there has to be a paradigm shift in empirical studies to understand and capture the gender effects in development narrative. So most of our empirical studies in recent times, basically we go to the field, and what we do is to interview households, right? And most of these household heads that we interview are men, with only a few minority of them being females. A typical example, a study I have conducted in Togo just last 2-3 years back. Out of the sample of about 500 households who were interviewed, less than 5% of them were females. So no matter how much the impact is at this level, you may not be able to net it out because of the few representation. So females are disproportionately represented in every empirical study. So there should be a paradigm shift in how empirical studies are conducted, and moving such studies from the household level to come into the household itself and look at the dynamics, so that you can capture the gender dynamics and how these effects really work in terms of males and females, and how they can easily be targeted in terms of policy to improve their welfare, their economic well-being, and their food security status as well. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alira, for the nice presentation of your work. I think I would take it then to Dr. Akuriba to present her work.
Okay. Thank you, Sabine, and thank you to the Women and Water team for having me. So in the next few minutes, I will be sharing some highlights and observations that I've made over the years from my involvement in agricultural water research in Northern Ghana specifically, and in Africa as a whole. Okay, so water, as we all know, is a valuable resource. Apart from the domestic use that we all use it for, another critical use of water is for agric. And in Ghana, agricultural use of water is normally by direct watering of crops from rain. That is a natural way. Besides that, we also do dry season farming by using water from harvested water stored in reservoirs, normally harvested from runoffs such as rivers, streams. We also extract groundwater also for dry season farming. And dry season farming is what we refer to here as irrigation. So communities in relatively dry areas in Ghana and in Africa by extension normally practice irrigation in the dry season to supplement what they get from their rain-fed activities. So irrigation in Northern Ghana, for instance, usually from October to April. And you can tell that the dry season period is quite longer than the rainy season period, which is just about 4 months. And irrigation generally has several benefits. A research study that I did with colleagues and from literature indicates that it has significant and positive impacts on farm incomes, on employment, consumption, food security, among many other things. And for women in particular, having an increase in income increases the nutritional intake of their households. And that is because in Ghana, and particularly in northern Ghana, where I live and work, women are basically the caretakers. They decide what the family feeds on. They don't decide on how resources are sometimes used, but for feeding, cooking, women are the main decision makers when it comes to that. They take care of the kids, their health, their nutritional status. And so for a woman to have an increase in income, it has a direct relation with the nutritional intake of the households. And for irrigation, we have different types of them happening in Ghana here. And normally the typology depends on the water source and the mode of water conveyance or application. And the water source is basically from either surface water or sometimes from groundwater. So for the surface water systems, the source of water is mostly from harvested runoffs into dams, what we refer to as the small-scale reservoirs. So the small-scale reservoirs, for instance, are the commonest systems that we use. And normally after their construction, either by the government or an NGO, these systems are are given out to the communities. So the communities decide on their management structure by forming a water user association, and the water user association decides on how to maintain these activities. Dry season farming, some also extract water from, get water from dugouts. The dugouts are quite similar to the small scale reservoirs, some from rivers and streams, and mostly the mode of water conveyance is through canals, that is by using the gravity flow system. So the two pictures that I have on the screen are examples of how a typical small-scale reservoir looks like. So the second picture is the canal. So normally the canal takes the water from the reservoir direct into the irrigated farms. And then the conveyance, some also use watering cans. Those that are able to afford use pumping machines. So these are examples of how the watering cans look like. So they fetch from whichever source the water is coming from, and they pour it directly onto the field. And if it's a pump, they pump the water from the source direct into the field. So for the groundwater system, the source of water is mostly from deep aquifers like deep wells. Some also extract water from shallow wells along valleys. Some use water from boreholes, and the boreholes sometimes can be manual, as in the example you see in the picture down left. And then some are mechanized. And for the conveyance, it's mostly by bucket fetch. They tie a rope to the bucket and then submerge it into the well to lift up the water onto the plot. A good example is in the picture to the right, the first picture to the right. So they submerge the bucket into the well. And so this kind of system is quite tedious. So generally in Ghana, irrigated agriculture is dominated by men. And that is, for instance, the small-scale reservoir systems are like the type that allows gravity flow. They are the commonest, but these systems are mainly operated by men. And that is because, as mentioned by the first speaker, access to productive resources, especially in patrilineal societies, and that is basically where my research so far have always been carried in. Patrilineal societies, the access to resources are limited to women because the men have the right to inherit properties from the households. So women participation is prominent in the bucket fetch, the tedious side, the bucket fetch irrigation side, because that one, anywhere you can access any land in the peripheral, maybe along the rivers or along in the valleys, you can just dig to extract the water for your irrigation. So the women are mostly involved in the bucket fetch side. These systems are quite tedious, but the investment cost there too is relatively low compared to maybe the systems where you have to use a pumping machine to extract the water onto the field. And that is partly the reason that women are mostly resource poor, because they really do not inherit from the households. So to enhance women participation, over the years, some NGOs and private individuals have invested in some irrigation structures to help women participate more in dry season farming. And these are a few examples of the systems that have happened so far. The commonest experiment that has been done is the barrel type, the blue container that you see. So it has an inlet that brings the water and an outlet that takes the water directly into the field through drip. So we even have some systems quite sophisticated, like the picture in the middle. This is a picture I took from Senegal some years back. We haven't seen this type in Ghana yet, but this is a system that the First Lady initiated and funded for women farmers in Senegal. So it's a good system, water conserving, water saving, but it's capital intensive. And that's for private farmers and rural farmers sometimes can be difficult to afford. So, and again, the sustainability of this system sometimes is questionable. The drip system we know is water saving, but it's also expensive, especially the mechanized type, as I've already mentioned. And for the manual ones that women can maybe afford, some of them are quite tedious to use, like in the first picture up there. Instead of in that system, there's no inlet. So the woman has to manually fill the barrel and now allow the water to drip onto the field. So it's quite tedious, so tiring to go through this process to get the water into it. So most instances, they prefer fetching the water and pouring it direct onto the field instead of filling the barrels and allowing them to drip. There are several challenges to irrigation development in Ghana, but these are just a few highlights. So paramount among them is the marketing challenge. So normally they go through a lot, especially for women who are resource poor, they go through a lot to invest, but in the end, they probably may not even get getting buyers is sometimes a challenge. And even when the buyers come, they offer low prices, especially in periods where there are glass, where all of them harvest, and then getting access to market becomes a challenge. And for the common system that we have, the small scale reservoir system, a lot of them are old, the canals are broken, they need repairs, and help is not really coming for to renovate them. So a number of them are abandoned because they are, broken beyond repairs. And then some of the water bodies like the rivers and streams, a lot of them are drying up probably because of, due to poor farming practices. And a recent upsurge in illegal mining has just led to a lot of the river, the water bodies drying up. Then we also have a challenge of inadequate access to resources like land and other inputs, as Alira already, deliberated on. Then we have especially high cost of inputs, especially for irrigators that go in for the pumping system. A lot of the complaints they give is that fuel prices are so high. So being able to afford fuel to use their pumping machine sometimes is very challenging. And generally, there's high costs involved in the developing, especially climate smart irrigation technology, like the drip system, some of the drip systems that I've already elaborated on. So I think I will pause here for my other colleagues to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Then I take it to Dr. Tiano.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sabine, for giving me the floor. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure water and foods with Margaret and Alira. So in this lecture, I will focus mainly on women's employment issue in rural areas, because one of the most pressing, sorry, I have to share my screen. Just give me a few minutes to share my screen now. Okay. Excuse me. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to participate in this lecture on women, water, and food security with Margaret and Alira. So in this lecture, I will focus mainly on women's employment issue in rural areas, because one of the most pressing issues in rural Africa, especially in rural Senegal, is the question of how women can live using gender-specific constraints while at the same time improving lives and food security of their families. And the good news is that researchers, policymakers, and gender experts point toward compelling answers. So let me open by highlighting some evidence taken straight from our recent paper entitled women's employment issue in rural Senegal. What can we learn from non-farm diversification strategies? By non-farm diversification strategies, we mean participation in both farming or paper is the fact that non-farm activities are rapidly expanding in the developing world. However, most of these activities are undertaken by men and young people. Still, little is known about the opportunities this expansion may provide for women. So in our paper, we try to look at this issue by investigating the gender differentiated impact of non-farm diversification in rural Senegal using both an individual and a household level approach. What we find is at the individual level, diversification improves women's well-being through large income increasing effects, but has no effect being. And at the household level, you find that when all women diversify, households are less likely to be food insecure than when only men or both genders turn of the paper. Over the past years, Senegal has taken many steps to make policies more gender responsive. In 2016, the government has implemented the National Strategy for Gender Equity and Equality as a key element to resources and opportunities. But despite massive progress in access to agricultural inputs and land, gender gaps still persist as most of women are engaged in low productive segments and have limited access to productive resources compared to live in rural areas, and most of them are women who depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. In this context, we think that the participation of women in non-farm activities can have an important implication for their well-being, because based on studies conducted in sub-Saharan Africa, female diversification strategies can not only improve household income and food security, but also empower women. However, such findings cannot be generalized and need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So in our paper, we try to assess the gender differentiated impact of non-farm diversification strategies in rural Senegal. For that, we focus mainly on two questions. The first one is focusing only on farm work, and do households where only women diversify into non-farm activities are better off than households where only men or both genders diversify. So to answer the first question, we use the following model where Y is a well-being outcome, D is a dummy variable, taking the value of 1 if women adopt diversification strategies, and X is a vector of individual and household counter variable. So here, diversification is our main independent variable, and we consider that a woman diversifies if she participates in both farming and non-farming activities. At this point, we classify the diversification into two groups depending on earnings. We have low return diversification if the earnings in non-farm activities are below the average in farm activity. That being said, we do believe that the choice to diversify into the non-farm sector is not random and depends on a set of observed and unobserved factors, which could lead to biased estimate. To deal with this potential source of bias, we use an IV approach to estimate the effect of diversification on women's well-being. And to answer the second question, we use the following model where Y is the household well-being outcome and D captures diversification here at the household level, And diversification here is our main independent variable. It takes the value of 1 if only women diversify in the household, the value of 2 if only men diversify, 3 if both women and men diversify, and 4 if no one diversify. And here's the well-being outcome is captured by 2 variables. The first one is the household income per member, and the second one is the household food security status. So to implement our study, we use data from the poverty monitoring survey conducted by the National Bureau of Statistics. And this survey collected a wide range of information, including socioeconomic, demographic factors, and labor market outcomes using individual and household level questionnaires. So briefly, what we can see from graph 1 is that diversification is a male-dominated livelihood strategy, as only 30% of women diversify into non-farm activities. And graph 2 and 3 report that women who diversify into non-farm activities earn high incomes, and are more empowered than those who focus only on farming, indicating that diversification tends to be associated with improved female well-being. Let me now jump to the econometric result. So here, table 1 here reports the effect of diversification on men's and women's income. And what we find is, while diversification is a male-dominated activity, we find no difference in income between men adopting diversification and those focusing only on farming. And regardless of whether women diversify into low or high return non-farm activities, we find that women who diversify earn high incomes than their female counterparts engaging only in farming. And also, as expected, high return diversification activities have larger income increasing effects compared with low return diversification activities. Okay, so table 2 here reports the effect of diversification on women's empowerment. And we find that women are by far more empowered than their female counterpart engaging only in farming. We also find that women are much more empowered when they diversify into high return non-farm activities than when they diversify into low return diversification. And the table 3 here, and table 3 reports the effect of diversification on household well-being. And findings indicate that households have significantly higher income level when both genders diversify. And we can see that this gain is living standards is driven by the large income increasing effects of female diversification, given that diversification has no effect at all on men's income. Findings also indicate that households are most likely to be food secure when only women diversify or both genders diversify. So given the positive livelihood outcomes of female diversification strategies, we think it is important to investigate the main drivers and barriers to the adoption of diversification strategies. And in this table, okay, we can see that young and married women who dedicated less time to domestic workloads are more likely to diversify into non-farm activities. However, when we classify diversification into low and high return diversification, we found that women's decision to diversify into high return non-farm activities is mostly influenced by age, education, and the number of working members, meaning that young and educated women are more likely to participate in high return non-farm activities. But somewhat surprisingly, female participation in high return diversification strategies did not seem to be constrained by the time spent on domestic workload. And the finding made sense once we explore the survey data. In fact, the data revealed that the majority of women carried out all domestic tasks before and after work and during their days off. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Thieno, for the very interesting research study from Senegal. Well, looking at all your three presentations today, taking us from Togo and livestock production over agriculture production and irrigation in northern Ghana, and finally Thieno showing us his research on non-farm diversification in rural Senegal. What do you think across these countries and across these different cases are the biggest obstacles, according to your research, to women's participation in agriculture production, irrigation practices, and also non-farm diversification strategies? Alira, do you like to start?
Yes, I can take it up from here. So thank you very much, Dr. Sabine. And it's interesting to see how these studies, although independent of one another, come to very interesting conclusions and have found some nexus in the participation of women in off-farm employment or agriculture in general and food security. So from my side of the divide, I think the key aspects of that are mitigating against women participating in productive activities in these areas include productive ownership of productive assets like land, like livestock, and engaging in paid jobs. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier on, ownership of land, for example, is still more of a patrilineal type of thing. So these societies are mainly men dominated and they are patriarchal in nature. So women are still left behind in terms of owning land. So women do not have access to land. And even in cases where they have access to this land, they are not guaranteed long-term ownership of these lands. So they are not really motivated to invest more into productive ventures. For example, like also Dr. Akuriba mentioned for Ghana, if you can see that to be able to participate in irrigation system, you need to invest money into buying some machines and making some construction. So if you don't own this land and you know that just investing money in these structures, after 1 or 2 years, you can be sacked from this land, then you would be limited in how much investment you can put into it. Okay, so these are some of the things I see from my side and from the research that I have done so far, some of the things that are really holding back women into full-time participating in high intensity agriculture or engaging in very high return agricultural activities or economic activities for sub-Saharan Africa or rural households for that matter.
Okay, so to add to what Alira has just described, I do agree that land access to resources is a key challenge that women face. In addition to that, he has already talked a lot about land. In addition to that, access to finance is generally a challenge for farmers due to because agriculture is always attributed as being a risky venture. So most of the finance institutions are sometimes reluctant in giving out credit to farmers. And for women that are resource poor, women from patrilineal, societies that have that have limited access to physical assets like land, it is even more difficult for them to get, be able to get loans from the financial institutions. And that is because in most instances, they do not have the the physical asset to use as collateral, as most of the financial institutions require that one submits a collateral. So that in the event that you are unable to pay back the loan, then they can capitalize on that to get their money back. So women being resource poor hardly have the opportunity to access any financial support from the financial institutions. And besides land finance, I think the third critical thing is market. So sometimes women go through a lot to get money from their own savings, from relatives, to go into farming. But in the end, sometimes when the market is not good, when prices are so low, they end up even being worse than they were before. So markets is a critical factor one must consider when you are trying to invest in, especially irrigation facilities for women to participate. Yeah.
Thank you, Alira and Margaret. Theano, do you like to add, from your perspective, what are the biggest obstacles for women participating in non-farm diversification? Elaborating maybe. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sadi, for giving me a follow once again. So based on our research paper, what we see is that women's ability to participate in non-farm activities, especially in high return non-farm activities, depend mainly on their level of education. So those women that have a very low level of education hardly participate in high return non-farm activities. So from that, so from this perspective, we can say that providing technical assistance to women can make non-farm activities more sustainable, and also improving their skills will create more economic opportunities and more good non-farm jobs for women. So the main obstacle here is education, and also somewhat surprisingly, the domestic workload is not a main obstacle for female participation in high return non-farm activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Theano. Well, we have talked about obstacles. Now, very relatedly, the next natural question is, what can we then learn from your research in order to improve the situation? As Alira mentioned it in the beginning, how can we work on closing the gender gap? What do you see from your research? Which contributions we can make in order to contribute to a smaller gender gap, or to remove the gender gap altogether?
Okay, so if I can start, I think from my observation and from what Alira said, it looks like the patrilineal system limits women's access to land. But that system is a tradition that cannot be changed easily. But then it can be bettered. So I'm thinking that maybe by sensitizing communities to have more participatory discussions normally on how intra-household resources should be distributed, and also letting them understand that there's a need for women to have full access to resources. And that is because they play a critical role as being caregivers. So women's access, for instance, to resources and having control over household resources can help improve the food and nutrition security of households, because they are basically the caretakers. And that is even, as Theano also mentioned, they basically carry out the household chores. So having access to resources that will bring in improved income will help in improving the food security situation of households. And for the marketing challenge that I mentioned, I'm thinking that external support that NGOs and sometimes governments provide to in the form of irrigation infrastructure for women to improve their participation. I'm thinking that normally they should approach it with a value chain approach. That is by providing support such as maybe linking them to buyers, or arranging some contract farming linkages for them, so that after harvest, they know where the produce is going to. If not, if the facility, the infrastructure is constructed, then the woman, manages to produce and she is unable to sell it, then she runs at a loss. So I'm thinking that approaching the whole intervention as trying to identify even buyers before identifying buyers as being part of the package of the intervention can go a long way to help women participation and improve the food and nutrition security of rural farmers, and then in women, in women households in particular.
Yeah, so if I can just also put in a word or two based on what you have just said. So like I said from the very last of my my presentation on this paradigm shift. So as researchers, as people who are out there trying to look out for the root causes of some of these things and make policy recommendations, we need to look more into the intra-household dynamics, okay, so that we understand what is happening in the household. For example, we want to see how power or resources are distributed in the household. One thing I have come to realize along this time of research is that most of these patrilineal or patriarchal societies, the men who are the power brokers sometimes feel a bit reluctant to release power for the women, because they think that once you empower the woman, the man is losing some power. So more sensitization and education to let whoever the household head, the man is, to understand that men empowering your woman does not mean as a man you are losing some power, but rather you are redistributing the power in the household and making, giving a broader base for the ability for your household to cope with these necessary shocks that will come along the way. For example, with the woman being empowered and having an economic base that she can really rely on to support the man in the household. If their farm, which is exposed to these weather shocks, in the absence of any coping mechanism like credits unavailable or insurance schemes that are not working, the woman's economic muscle can be drawn upon. And with that, the household will not have to reduce their consumption drastically, but at least they may not be able to increase consumption, but will be able to maintain consumption to a minimum so that their food security concerns will not drop so much to make them very vulnerable to some of these weather shocks, which they are easily exposed to. Okay, so more sensitization, more education, and scientific, empirically understanding the dynamics in the household would be a proper entry point for us to be able to link up with policymakers to be able to give them evidence-based policies, which can then be targeted at empowering females or empowering women in these rural areas, economically especially, so that they become proper helpers and situated in a household where they are more appreciated because of what they bring onto the table, and as a whole help to improve the food security needs of the household and the nutritional outcome of the children as well, who are mostly dependent on their mothers. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations and conversation. I know we're reaching the end of the hour here, but before we go, we have one question from the audience, which is for each of the guests, as from Hakan Armagan, is as an educator, I'm curious, are there any school programs dedicated to educating kids, boys and girls, about these issues? Does anyone have any experience from their own research on what type of school programs might be available?
Yeah, so if I may just jump in here, this question is a little bit broad. So about these issues, I don't know whether the person is asking about issues relative to food security or empowering women, or talking about the gender dimensions that we are talking about here. But for Ghana, where I come from originally, there are issues that there are schools programs that are trying to empower the girl child. So there are a number of interventions in most rural areas where education of the girl child is mostly lagging behind the boy child in terms of who gets the chance to go to school and at what time. So there are a number of projects which are usually internationally funded, who trying to bridge this gap between the male and female child in terms of education. And when it comes to the issue of climate change shocks and all those things, this is for the developing world, it is not yet something that is received so much attention in terms of bringing it to the classroom. Although in the higher levels, like the universities and the secondary education, there are climate change courses ongoing, but this needs to be to trickle down to the very basic education level, and this is not yet there. I am sure the education sector and also the governments are planning to do it, but currently, as it stands, in the very down level of education, these things have not yet been started. I am not sure about it. I don't know if anybody has a different perspective to it.
Yes, I strongly agree with Alira. Here also in my country, Senegal, we don't have such kind of school programs educating kids on this issue. So all we have is just some programs that try to empower women and girls. But as for specific program, we don't have this kind of program. Thank you.
And the next question that we have is a question for Dr. Margaret. Coming from the northern part of Ghana, I observed majority of young ladies in these areas move to the southern part and make a living, and reduces women's participation in irrigation in the north. I would like to know if there's been some policies or initiatives like the 1V or 1D implanted to keep these young ladies in the north.
Okay, so yeah, I will attempt to answer this. So the 1V, 1D, it's not specifically for these young ladies that move down south for greener pastures, but for farmers generally. But for the young ladies that are willing and are able to go into farming, if they want to take that opportunity, in most instances, I think it's allowed. But I think that the first part is asking. So yeah, I think that is it. So the 1V, 1D is not specific to the young ladies, but they are constructed for farmers generally. But then normally it's open to all, but because women have limited access, I wonder if some of these ladies will have access to. But I'm not aware of any irrigation schemes specifically constructed to help curb this menace of rural-urban migration, mostly from the northern sector to the southern part in search of greener pastures.
If I can just add something to support what you have just said. So basically, this policy of the government is not targeted at ladies, like Dr. Akuruba already said. But if from my perspective as a researcher and somebody who is familiar with this rural-urban migration, if the program is properly implemented, it has a spillover positive effect to reduce this rural-urban migration, because one of the key or critical reasons why these young girls move from the north of Ghana to the south of Ghana to search for jobs is because of the lack of opportunities, economic opportunities up north, and also very much because there is only one production system, one production season, in the northern part of Ghana, which usually lasts like Dr. Kuriba said, between 4 to 5 months of rainfall, and then that is it. So once the crop is harvested, then these young girls, if they are not in school, then they have nothing to do. So they have to move down to the south where the economic activities are ongoing, and then they can participate there and get these menial jobs to undertake and earn something to go back to the north when the rainy season is about to start and production or farming is about to begin. So this 1V, 1D, which is one village, one dam facilities, if they are properly implemented, what it means is that there will be more farming activities. And when farmers are producing more, then these girls would have more, they can be employed, because when the farmers are producing more, they will need more hands to harvest, they will need more hands to sell, they will need more people to do different jobs on the farm. So then instead of traveling to the south where normally they are exposed to a lot of social vices like rape, they get some of them get harsh treatments, they get even teenage pregnancies and get abused in different forms. They would prefer to stay up north, participate in all year round farming system. And then with that, they can become economically empowered, and in a way that would have positive trickling effects for their families as well, in terms of empowering them economically, providing for their food, taking care of their children, and then also open up these areas to other supply chain, the value chain. The people along the value chain will become more interested, and then they will move to these villages, and then it will open the village for development. So the initiative actually is a very good initiative, but it's a political one, and there are still some loose ends that needs to be tied to make it more concrete and to make it yield the desired results that would be beneficial to these people. And it is a way that can stop this north-south migration as you have identified. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations and very thoughtful answers to these very interesting questions from the audience. I know that we have to finish the formal portion of the program now. And so I'd like to thank everyone who attended today's event.